Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that might feel uncomfortably familiar, especially if you've ever thought about George Orwell's 1984.
Hmm.
We often instinctively view war as, a diplomatic failure, a last resort.
Right. The worst case scenario.
But what if, for some of the world's most powerful nations, conflict has evolved into something, well, far more intricate? What if it's become a consistent, maybe even profitable engine driving both their economies and their political systems?
That's the core of it, isn't it? This challenging idea.
Exactly. That's the provocative idea we're going to unpack today. This notion that war isn't just about battles won or lost, but maybe functions as a constant, self-sustaining, well, business model. It's a challenging lens for sure, but one our source material really compels us to look through.
And what's truly compelling here, I think, is how this analysis uses Orwell's vision, not just as, fictional dystopia, but as a kind of framework for understanding our current geopolitical economy.
Framework, yeah.
It suggests a world where conflict is less an emergency to be resolved and more like a built-in feature of the global system itself. It fosters this perpetual state of war, but maybe in a much broader, more insidious sense than we usually think.
Precisely. So our deep dive today really centers on a groundbreaking analysis from Skylar Fiction's Empire on Repeat, how the U.S., China, and Russia profit from perpetual war.
Quite a title.
It is. And the work asks this central, kind of uncomfortable question. How do these three global titans, the United States, China, and Russia, despite all their profound ideological differences, somehow find common ground in benefiting from and maybe even actively perpetuating a state of, well, perpetual conflict?
And to get at that, we've really meticulously sifted through Skylar Fiction's detailed work, and that itself draws on some highly authoritative sources.
Right.
We're talking about places like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. They're renowned for their data on global arms transfers.
The go-to source for that, really.
Absolutely. And then there's the RAND Corporation, whose policy research gives these unique insights, plus investigative reporting from outlets like the Washington Post, The Intercept, really critical voices.
So our mission today is to help you cut through the information noise. We're here to help you understand the intricate ways war functions, not just as a geopolitical event, but as literal infrastructure and a consistent source of profit for these nations.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. A shortcut to grasping the what and the why behind this, well, this unsettling reality, leaving you well-informed and, we hope, maybe a little more critical about how global power really operates.
Okay.
So let's begin. Let's peel back the layers of America's war machine first.
Right. When we start looking at America's approach to global conflict, there's this core concept that emerges from the sources: military Keynesianism.
Okay, military Keynesianism. Break that down a bit.
So it refers to this specific government policy, one that deliberately leverages military spending as a primary engine for economic growth and employment.
Right. I remember traditional Keynesianism from econ class.
Yeah.
Government spending on public works or social programs to stimulate the economy, especially during downturns.
Exactly. But military Keynesianism is different. It funnels billions, huge sums, directly into defense contractors, into weapons development, and importantly, into the burgeoning arms export market.
And the analysis we looked at makes it clear this isn't some, accidental side effect.
Not at all. It's identified as an integral feature of the U.S. economic model. Think of it like a constant strategic injection of capital into the economy, specifically through the defense sector. It creates jobs, boosts corporate profits. It's all quite large scale.
Okay, feature, not bug. Got it.
A really powerful example, one that illustrates this clearly, is the substantial U.S. aid that went to Ukraine after the 2022 Russian invasion.
Right, that was huge news. Billions of dollars.
Over $174 billion committed. Now, publicly, it was presented as critical assistance to a democracy under attack. And it was. But a closer look, especially through analysis like Adam Taylor's in the Washington Post, reveals something crucial.
Which is?
A significant portion of that aid. Well, it never actually left American soil. Much of it flowed directly back into the pockets of U.S. defense firms. Think Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, the big players.
Huh. So it wasn't just shipping crates of weapons straight to Kiev.
Sometimes, yes. But often it involved the U.S. government paying American companies to replenish U.S. military stockpiles that had been drawn down to send to Ukraine. or procuring brand new weapons specifically for Ukraine, but bought from U.S. firms.
Ah, okay, so new lucrative contracts for American defense companies were generated by this aid package.
Precisely. So, in essence, you have this situation where humanitarian urgency was strategically transformed into a massive, if maybe indirect, subsidy for the U.S. defense industry. It's this economic feedback loop, and the sources suggest it's both intentional and highly effective.
Intentional, that's a strong word.
Well, look at the RAND Corporation's report, Export or Expire. It's strikingly candid about this.
Export or expire. Wow.
Yeah. It states, pretty unequivocally, that U.S. defense exports are, and I quote, vital for sustaining the domestic industrial base. Especially, it notes, in niche areas where maybe production volumes are low, but the unit costs are really high.
So the implication is?
The implication seems clear. America exports weapons not just to project influence or support allies, but fundamentally to keep its own factories running, keep its innovation pipeline flowing, keep its skilled workforce employed. It's like a direct admission that military Keynesianism is deeply institutionalized. It's used intentionally as a foundational economic strategy.
Okay, and then there's this other mechanism you mentioned.
Yeah.
The Presidential Drawdown Authority. That sounds technical, but interesting.
It is. It basically allows the president to send weapons and equipment directly from existing U.S. stockpiles without needing immediate congressional approval. So it's faster in a crisis.
Okay, sounds practical for emergencies.
It can be, but framed publicly, it looks like an act of generosity or urgent support. The practical result, though, as outlined in our sources, is this predictable surge in defense procurement down the line.
Because what goes out must come back in.
Exactly. What's given away has to be restocked. And that restocking, naturally, happens at taxpayer expense. So it's this system that kind of masterfully converts political goodwill, humanitarian crises even, into massive, reliable defense contracts. It cloaks profit, you could argue, in the language of solidarity and urgent aid.
That's quite a mechanism.
And the sheer scale of this spending is just immense. The U.S. defense budget for 2024, it stands around $886 billion.
$886 billion. It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It really is. And what's particularly striking is the bipartisan consensus around it. You know, despite deep political divisions on almost everything else,
Yeah.
military spending often remains, as the sources put it, politically sacred.
Untouchable.
Which leads to this profound distortion of economic priorities. Every dollar, for instance, spent on weapons and their replenishment is a dollar that cannot be invested in healthcare, education, updating vital civilian infrastructure.
The opportunity cost.
Exactly. It creates this stark paradox. We're building incredibly expensive, sophisticated tools, not for lasting utility, but precisely to be destroyed or expended, which then demands constant replenishment.
Which fuels more production.
Right. It highlights the inherent profitability of a perpetual conflict economy for the United States. Creation serves destruction, and destruction, in turn, fuels more creation.
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. This idea that aid is actually a marketing strategy and security cooperation is just a fancy term for a sales pitch. It feels like we're moving beyond just the domestic economic engine now.
We are, because America also operates as essentially a global arms monopolist.
Monopolist, that's strong too.
Well, the numbers back it up. The United States currently commands an astonishing 43% of global arms exports, according to that SIPRI data we mentioned.
43%, wow. How does that compare?
To put it in perspective, that's more than 4 times the amount exported by France, which is the next largest exporter.
4 times number 2, okay.
So this isn't just, statistical dominance. It reflects a fundamental structure of global power. Arms exports, the sources argue, are far from neutral transactions. They're potent diplomatic tools. They provide economic lifelines to client states. They serve as instruments of influence that extend American military reach far beyond its borders.
And in doing so,
They create dependent allies. And in a kind of twisted way, often perpetuate the very conflicts they're supposedly designed to prevent or resolve.
now, this U.S. market dominance, it isn't exactly new, right? But the sources point to a big surge after 2022.
That's right. Historically, the U.S. averaged maybe around 35% of global arms exports. Still huge, but not 43%. The post-2022 increase, especially following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, really highlights a deliberate strategy. That conflict triggered what the sources describe as a rearming frenzy across Europe. European nations, suddenly feeling vulnerable, saw their arms imports surge by a staggering 155% between 2020 and 2024.
155% increase.
Yeah. They were scrambling to replace depleted stockpiles, modernize their militaries. So while the headlines focused on humanitarian support for Ukraine, the underlying numbers, as SIPRI's database reveals, told a different story.
Which was?
This was a massive market expansion for U.S. arms manufacturers. Europe actually overtook the Middle East to become the top destination for U.S. exports during that period.
So these big deals we hear about, Poland buying Patriots, helicopters, F-35.
Exactly. Poland signed contracts worth over $20 billion for those U.S. systems.
Ugh.
Or look at India, actively being courted with promises of advanced aircraft and defense tech.
It's not just about defense then.
Well, these deals are often presented as matters of defense, deterrence, alliance, solidarity. But they explicitly serve commercial interests, too. And each agreement doesn't just expand America's economic footprint. It deeply embeds these client nations within the U.S. military infrastructure.
How's that embedding work?
Their military doctrines, their training, even their spare parts become intrinsically dependent on the U.S. supply chain. It ensures long-term loyalty, you could say, and definitely ongoing revenue streams for the suppliers.
And you mentioned this isn't accidental, it's institutionalized. That Rand report again.
Yes, export or expire. It makes it clear that the Department of Defense and the State Department actively coordinate these arms export strategies. And a core reason: to sustain domestic production lines.
Economies of scale.
Exactly. Foreign sales ensure higher production volumes, which then drives down the per-unit costs for U.S. buyers, like the Pentagon itself. So selling F-35s to allies isn't just about global security. It effectively makes those jets cheaper for the U.S. military. And, of course, significantly more profitable for manufacturers like Lockheed Martin.
Okay, and this involves some interesting language, right? Euphemisms.
Oh, absolutely. This is classic Orwellian branding at play. The U.S. government consistently uses phrases like security cooperation or capacity building.
Sounds positive. Helpful, even.
Right. They serve to mask the underlying economic and strategic motives behind what sounds like benevolent moral language. The sources even highlight how porous the so-called export control regimes are.
Meaning?
These are supposedly in place to restrict sales to responsible buyers only, but the analysis notes that human rights abusers routinely receive U.S. weapons if they're deemed strategic partners. The moral filter, it seems, is highly selective. It's enforced primarily by perceived allegiance to American interests, not necessarily by actual human rights records.
And the Ukraine war itself becomes an advertisement.
In a tragic twist, yes. Systems like the HIMARS rocket launchers, which got a lot of media attention for their effectiveness on the battlefield, function as powerful marketing tools for international buyers.
How tested?
Exactly. And the Pentagon's lend and replenish strategy, sending existing gear abroad and then reordering replacements from contractors, ensures a constant cycle of demand. This not only benefits the defense industry, but also significantly expands the U.S. market share globally. It's a remarkably effective, though you could argue ethically troubling, business model.
But this dominance must have consequences for the buyers, the smaller nations.
Definitely. They become militarily and politically dependent on the United States. Their entire defense setup doctrines, training, spare parts relies on a single supplier.
Which limits their options.
Severely. This dependency can erode their sovereignty, create long-term entanglements, stifle the growth of their own independent defense capabilities. But from the U.S. perspective, it effectively creates what the sources call locked-in clients, nations that can't easily switch suppliers or deviate too far from U.S. influence.
So, connecting this back.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means that the line between geopolitical strategy and commercial interests often just disappears. Conflict becomes a profitable, ongoing enterprise. The U.S. isn't just fighting wars, it's actively equipping them. It's not just projecting force, it's selling it. And the result is this geopolitical economy where peace becomes maybe improbable and conflict becomes profoundly profitable, an integral part of the system.
We've seen how America's war machine is this kind of self-sustaining economic powerhouse. But what happens when a nation aims for similar global power? Not through that kind of market saturation, but through a quieter, more self-sufficient path. Our sources describe China as a master of silent ascent.
That's a crucial distinction. And the SIPRI data backs this up. It reveals that China's arms imports have dropped by a staggering 64% in the past 5 years.
Imports dropped, so they're buying less from others.
Exactly. And this isn't a sign of demilitarization, far from it. Rather, it reflects a highly successful internal consolidation and a determined pivot toward indigenous capability. China now manufactures the vast majority of its own armored vehicles, aircraft, naval systems. It's a major transition from being a dependent buyer to a highly competitive, self-reliant global producer.
Okay, so while its overall weapons exports are still smaller than the U.S., China's strategy is different, more precise.
Incredibly precise and strategic. They don't just flood markets. Instead, they meticulously target fragile or emerging economies, offering affordable alternatives to Western systems. We see this pattern in places like Nigeria, Myanmar, Pakistan, Venezuela.
But it's not just about the hardware, is it? The sources introduce this concept, China's belt and barrel strategy.
Right, the belt and barrel. It's ingenious in a way because it directly links military sales to China's huge, ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Okay, how does that work? Like a package deal.
Pretty much. Imagine it like this. China doesn't just sell you a tank, it sells you the entire system that supports it. Maybe the roads to move it on, the training for the crew, and often the long-term loans to pay for it all. These comprehensive packages are bundled with critical infrastructure projects, military training, debt arrangements, all under the BRI umbrella. It's not just a sale, it's a profound embedding of China's economic and geopolitical influence.
And these arms exports,
Yeah,
they carry a message, an ideological one.
a clear, if maybe unspoken one. Chinese companies like Norinco and Poly Technologies are highlighted in the sources as offering weaponry without questions.
Weaponry without questions, meaning no strings attached.
Essentially, no inspections, no lectures on human rights, no political conditions, just the equipment. This is a stark contrast to Western firms, which often come with conditions related to human rights or democratic governance, at least on paper.
So China positions itself as the neutral supplier.
Exactly. The non-interventionist supplier, claiming neutrality while providing tools that, let's be honest, can easily be used for repression by the regimes buying them.
And this is easier for China because of its state control.
That streamlines it massively. Unlike U.S. defense contractors who have to navigate congressional approvals and public debate, China's state-owned enterprises are direct extensions of the Communist Party. This lets Beijing seamlessly weave military deals into larger diplomatic packages. Pakistan's JF-17 fighter jet program, co-developed with China, is a classic example. It symbolizes this shared military destiny forged by Beijing, not Washington. It showcases China's very integrated approach to soft power and long-term influence.
And their ambitions are clearly growing. The naval expansion is staggering.
It really is. The People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, has launched more warships since 2015 than any other fleet in the world. Its rapidly growing presence, South China Sea, Indian Ocean, even showing up in the Atlantic, it signals a new paradigm. China is no longer just a regional power. It's asserting itself globally, projecting power far beyond its immediate neighborhood.
But their soft power is different from the U.S. model.
Very different. It's uniquely calibrated. It doesn't seem to aim for cultural adoration, like the U.S. once did with Hollywood and pop culture. Instead, it seeks compliance through economic necessity. It sells predictability, stability, rather than protection in the Western sense.
It's a paradox.
It is. It's the paradox at the heart of China's rise. They talk about harmony, yet tighten military alliances. They reject interventionism, yet arm autocrats. They promise non-hegemony, yet build a navy to rival empires. In those Orwellian terms we keep coming back to, where contradiction isn't failure but strategy. Maybe neutrality is control.
Okay, let's shift from the physical battlefield, the hardware, to the digital one. The sources are really explicit here. 21st century warfare is increasingly fought with databases, drones, algorithms.
And China hasn't just grasped this transformation, they've made it a central pillar of their geopolitical strategy. Surveillance has become both this domestic instrument of control and a highly exportable tool of influence.
This is where it gets kind of chilling, isn't it?
It really is. Internally, China operates what the sources describe as arguably the most sophisticated surveillance regime in human history. We're talking over 600 million facial recognition cameras in public spaces recording everything.
600 million.
And its social credit system, powered by AI and big data, tracks behaviors. Everything from jaywalking to online dissent. And these systems aren't just punitive, they're predictive. Algorithms can determine which individuals are deemed untrustworthy before any crime is even committed.
Predictive policing on a massive scale.
It's beyond that, almost. In Orwellian terms, this isn't just thought crime anymore. It feels like a terrifying leap into pre-thought crime.
And this surveillance empire, it's not staying within China's borders.
Not at all. Companies like Hikvision, Dahua, Huawei, They've exported these very technologies to over 80 countries, mostly in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America.
How are these sold? What's the pitch?
Often they're presented as smart city innovations, promising better traffic control, crime reduction, enhanced public safety, things people want. But embedded in the code, the sources warn, are potential backdoors, censorship protocols, AI-driven profiling tools specifically designed to serve autocratic ends.
So it's the built-and-barrel idea again, but with digital infrastructure.
Exactly. This global export strategy mirrors their military philosophy. They sell the infrastructure of power, not just the weapon. While the U.S. provides tanks and planes, China provides the operating system to govern. It's less visually imposing, maybe, but arguably more insidious. It quietly alters the power structures of states by embedding these authoritarian logics directly into their technological nervous systems.
And arms deals now come bundled with this tech.
Often, yes. Surveillance systems, riot suppression gear. Drones sold to Middle Eastern and African governments often come equipped with facial recognition and crowd dispersion features, tools of state repression offered without much moral pretense.
And China has an edge in selling this stuff.
A distinct competitive advantage. Its non-transparent legal system, state-subsidized corporations, they allow it to bypass the human rights laws and public scrutiny that democratic nations often face, at least in theory. China has effectively built a global marketplace for digital repression, and sadly, the demand for these tools seems to be steadily rising.
What about the ideology embedded in this tech?
That's perhaps the most concerning part. When a country installs a Chinese surveillance system, it's not just collecting data, it's adopting a fundamental worldview. A worldview where the state sees everything, predicts everything, punishes in silence. Where dissent isn't debated or tolerated, it's just deleted. China projects this quiet confidence of inevitability. They don't need to advertise their surveillance supremacy. They just quietly offer governments the tools to make enemies of their own people, sometimes without anyone fully realizing the subtle shift in their society.
So what does this all mean? China isn't just selling weapons, it's selling the operating system for authoritarian control, quietly altering the power structures of states, creating a world where, yeah, like Orwell imagined, the state knows all.
Which leads us to that profound question you raised earlier. When technology facilitates submission through convenience rather than overt fear, does it make it even more insidious? I think the sources strongly suggest the answer is yes. It makes control pervasive, deeply embedded, almost imperceptible. It really blurs the lines of what it means to be free.
Okay, so beyond the hardware, the physical stuff, and the software, the surveillance tech, there's another crucial piece to China's global rise. Its propaganda machine. The sources frame propaganda as the prelude to war, emphasizing China's strategic narratives that are actively reshaping global perception.
Absolutely. And China's model isn't like the blunt, maybe theatrical broadcasts of Russia's RT. It's much more sophisticated. A hybrid system, soft power, subtle influence, digital saturation, uniquely suited to the 21st century.
Like their TV network, CGTN.
Exactly. China Global Television Network. It's meticulously styled after Western networks like CNN or the BBC. Sleek anchors, high production values, it gives the appearance of balanced journalism. But beneath that veneer inevitably lies a state-sanctioned perspective. It consistently favors Chinese geopolitical interests and diminishes dissent, subtly or sometimes not so subtly.
And this influence goes way beyond TV, right? TikTok comes up a lot.
Massively. TikTok, the most downloaded app in the world, owned by ByteDance, a company headquartered in Beijing, subject to Chinese cybersecurity law. Now, Western media often focuses on censorship within China. But the real power of TikTok globally, as the sources reveal, lies in its algorithm.
The black docs.
Right. That algorithm is capable of subtly shaping the emotional tempo of an entire generation. Content favorable to the Chinese state often gets elevated. Criticisms of the Communist Party, Xinjiang, Hong Kong protests might be quietly suppressed or just never seem to appear in users' feeds. It's hard to prove, but the potential is enormous.
It's not just about leaving things out, though. They push counter-narratives, too.
Oh, actively. For example, during the U.S. racial justice protests, Chinese state media relentlessly highlighted American police brutality to paint democracy as hypocritical. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese diplomats using Twitter, ironically, which is banned in China, actively spread theories that the virus originated in U.S. labs.
Reflexive control, the sources call it.
That's the term RAND researchers use. Indirect manipulation of an adversary's decision-making by carefully managing their perceptions. It's sophisticated stuff.
Even cultural exports, like the Confucius Institutes.
They play a role, too. Ostensibly, there are language and cultural centers embedded in universities worldwide, but they function as soft power arms. They promote sanitized versions of Chinese history, carefully avoid politically sensitive topics, and often enforce ideological alignment. Scholars who speak out against Chinese policies or just seem as critical can face pressure, surveillance, even blacklisting from these institutions.
And their role in UN peacekeeping.
China strategically leverages that too. It's not just about burnishing its image as a responsible global leader, although that's part of it. It also uses these missions to sell arms and riot control equipment to regimes that often mirror its own authoritarian governance model. It's this delicate dance.
Yeah.
Diplomacy and coercion, one foot in humanitarian optics, the other in maintaining control or expanding influence.
What really seems to distinguish China's propaganda is its quietness, its certainty.
Exactly. It doesn't need to convince the world of its superiority, not loudly anyway. It only needs to sow enough doubt about the alternatives. By pointing to Western chaos, Middle Eastern war fatigue, Russian dysfunction, it positions itself as the same stable middle path. In Orwellian terms, this isn't the loud, crushing boot. It's more like the gentle, persuasive pillow, muffling the cry of freedom with the promise of stability and order.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to Russia, an empire whose image for so long relied heavily on spectacle, right? Grand military parades in Red Square, those carefully choreographed videos of tanks and missiles.
All very impressive looking.
But beneath that carefully managed stagecraft lies what our sources describe as a withering arsenal, one that's been, frankly, brutally exposed by the grinding reality of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, the numbers on Russia's military decline are really stark. That SIPRI data we keep mentioning, it reveals a staggering 64% drop in Russian arms exports between the most recent 5-year period and the previous one.
64% drop in exports. Who stopped buying?
Major historical buyers like India and China have increasingly turned away. It's not just shifting geopolitical alliances, though that's part of it. It's a growing awareness that Russian hardware is often outdated, prone to failure, strategically limiting. China, as we discussed, is ramping up its own production. India has deliberately diversified its suppliers, turning more to Western nations like France and the US. Russia, once this proud arms dealer commanding significant market share, is now widely viewed as unreliable.
And the battlefield in Ukraine itself confirms this.
Vividly, reports from the ground, corroborated by NATO intelligence, open-source intelligence groups, they paint a pretty grim picture. Soviet-era tanks, sometimes missing essential parts, pulled from long-term storage in desperation.
Wow.
Russian conscripts, often lacking basic supplies, helmets, body armor, sometimes even functioning rifles. We've seen multiple high-profile instances where supposedly advanced Russian missiles veered off course or just failed midair. One leaked Russian report apparently concluded that over 50% of the armor they deployed in the Kherson region early on was either inoperable or destroyed within days.
So this isn't just normal battlefield wear and tear.
The sources argue it's much deeper. The culmination of decades of systemic corruption, chronic mismanagement, and a hollowed-out defense industrial base. The rot, as Catherine Belton chronicles in Putin's People, runs deep. It's tangled up in oligarch networks, inflated contracts where billions of rubles meant for defense were allegedly siphoned off by insiders. Contracts often awarded based on loyalty, not merit, leading to weapon systems that frequently failed basic tests before even leaving the factory.
And the sanctions imposed after 2022 haven't helped them.
They've tightened the noose significantly. U.S. and EU sanctions have effectively blocked key semiconductor components from reaching Russian weapons manufacturers. Without access to Western microelectronics, the production of things like guided missiles and drones has slowed dramatically. RAND analysts report Russia is trying to reverse engineer Chinese chips, but they're years behind the cutting edge.
Plus, there's the brain drain issue.
A huge factor. The economic strain from the war and sanctions triggered a significant brain drain. Skilled engineers, tech workers, leaving Russia in droves. A report from the Carnegie Endowment estimated over 1 million high-skilled workers left Russia in just the first year of the full-scale Ukraine invasion.
1 million skilled workers.
That hemorrhaging of talent further limits any future recovery for the military sector. It's leading to long-term industrial isolation. Russia, once a major power broker through its arms exports, now struggles to maintain influence even among historic allies. Nations like Syria are reportedly frustrated with delivery delays and subpar hardware.
Okay, so beyond the physical battlefield, there's this other desperate struggle happening. It feels like this isn't just about lying to the public anymore, is it? It seems more fundamental, like reshaping reality itself, especially when military failure clashes with these deep national myths.
You're absolutely right. This isn't merely disinformation. The sources frame it as something closer to a national hallucination, engineered by the state to ensure obedience and maintain power. It aligns perfectly with Orwell's warning about controlling the interpretation of reality itself. In post-invasion Russia, disinformation isn't just a tactic, it's become a lifeline.
And the scale of the Kremlin's apparatus seems, well, truly Orwellian.
It's pervasive. Domestically, the Russian people are bombarded with these tightly curated news cycles. The invasion of Ukraine is consistently portrayed as a special military operation against Nazi elements and Western-backed terrorism.
The official narrative.
Right. Casualties are consistently underreported or framed as noble sacrifices in a defensive, almost holy war. Foreign aid to Ukraine is painted as imperialist interference. Any independent journalists are either exiled, imprisoned, or simply drowned out by this overwhelming chorus of compliant state media voices. The line between legitimate news and state propaganda has been systematically erased.
And it plays on emotions.
Heavily. Evidence from the report Captured Emotions details how Russian state media strategically deploys emotionally charged stories to manipulate feelings. Themes of victimization, betrayal, righteousness. They're used constantly to anchor the narrative. It's what some call emotional governance.
So it's not about convincing people logically.
Not primarily. Propaganda isn't just about convincing Russians of the war's necessity. It's often designed to bypass rationality entirely. The war becomes not an event to analyze, but an identity to inhabit a sacred duty to the motherland. To question it is almost treasonous.
And this is amplified online, the troll farms.
Massively. Russia's notorious Internet Research Agency, the IRA, and its affiliated troll farms have mastered social media warfare. We saw their influence on U.S. politics back in 2016. By 2022, their tactics evolved. Twitter bots posting thousands of anti-Ukraine, anti-NATO memes in dozens of languages, Facebook groups pretending to be Western peace activists, subtly pushing Kremlin talking points, Telegram channels broadcasting faked videos of Ukrainian soldiers committing war crimes, videos later debunked but widely believed at the time. Rand's hugging with tactical arms confirms these efforts are coordinated, state-funded, and central to modern Russian military doctrine.
What are the goals? Just confusion.
It's multifaceted. Erode trust in Western institutions, portray Ukraine as morally equivalent to Russia, muddying the waters, sow apathy through information overload, making people just tune out. These aren't entirely new tactics. They're like turbocharged Cold War active measures. While the West often prides itself on media freedom, Russia seems to have adapted much more quickly to the chaos of digital post-truth. As Orwell warned, the past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth.
And they target specific countries abroad, too.
Definitely. Kremlin-aligned narratives target countries with strategic relevance. In Poland and Ukraine, Russian propaganda often leans on historic wounds, claiming NATO expansion threatens Russian cultural survival, framing Poland as a puppet of American aggression. In Africa and Latin America, Russia portrays itself as an anti-colonial counterbalance to Western imperialism, casting the Ukraine conflict as part of a global North-South struggle. The Center for European Policy Analysis documents how these narratives are meticulously fine-tuned to exploit existing tensions, not just create new ones.
But you said the most dangerous propaganda might be the one Russia tells itself.
That's arguably the case. In these echo chambers of televised nostalgia, the USSR's defeat in Afghanistan becomes a story of betrayal by the West. The fall of the Berlin Wall becomes a Western trick. Ukraine is framed as a little brother, corrupted by democracy, needing rescue. In these myths, victory is inevitable, not because it's earned, but because history demands it. Every setback is just a prelude to ultimate triumph. Every lie is a necessary sacrifice for the greater good.
While soldiers die for that narrative.
Exactly. Thousands of Russian soldiers sent to die for a cause cloaked in falsehood. Civil society shrinks, dissent is criminalized, and a generation is being raised in what can only be described as doublethink, believing both that Russia is winning and that it's surrounded by enemies too vast to defeat. This isn't just disinformation. It feels like a profound national hallucination, engineered by the state to ensure obedience and maintain power.
So we've explored the distinct military and economic strategies of the US, China, and Russia. They seem different on the surface. But what if we zoom out? Is there a shared thread tying them all together? It feels like modern war doesn't just start with tanks or missiles anymore. It starts with headlines, hashtags, press conferences.
That's a critical insight. It's not just the sound of boots on the ground, but the rhythm of narratives that truly prepares a nation for battle.
And while the methods differ,
The outcomes converge. That's what the sources suggest. Each power, US, China, Russia, operates a sophisticated machine designed to hijack public perception, to make consent seem automatic, resistance appear deviant, and questioning feel unpatriotic.
how does that play out differently in each case?
Well, in Russia, as we just discussed, the emotional register is deeply nostalgic. Captured emotions details how the Kremlin builds narratives not just on misinformation, but on profound emotional motivation. Old Soviet songs, World War II valor, images of grandmothers baking bread while bombs fall. It all reinforces this mythology of righteous struggle.
Making the war sacred, as you said.
Right. Ukrainians portrayed as Nazis, the West as morally diseased. These narratives, as researchers like Carla Berzins note, encode violence into family identity and religious duty. To oppose the war, in that context, is to betray the motherland itself.
Okay, and the United States is different, more clinical.
Often more clinical, yes, yet equally manipulative in its own way. The media frequently echoes the Pentagon's euphemisms. Surgical strike, humanitarian intervention, de-escalatory deployment. These phrases sanitize violence, obscure civilian deaths.
And the corporate sponsorship connection.
That's key. When major defense contractors like General Dynamics or Raytheon sponsor segments on networks like MSNBC or CNN, viewers aren't just getting news, they're absorbing corporate PR, laundered through national security discourse. Rand identified this as a feedback loop of justification. Each broadcast of violence becomes both content and confirmation for the public. War becomes this televised ritual. Think tanks issue dire warnings. Retired generals speak with urgency, ensuring the enemy always appears to be right at the gate.
And China, the velvet glove.
Exactly. China operates with that velvet glove. Through platforms like TikTok, Weibo, its state-affiliated global media, it projects this image of calm inevitability. It doesn't need to rage like Russia or moralize like America. Instead, it quietly promotes its vision of order, strength, benevolence.
Framing things carefully.
Very carefully. Taiwan is always a domestic affair. Hong Kong protests were foreign-inspired chaos. China's surveillance exports even come with PR kits emphasizing stability, efficiency, crime prevention. The Orwellian twist here is chilling. Thought crime no longer needs to be punished. It can be predicted and preemptive through technological control. It ensures the silent, pervasive form of psychological warfare.
So all three use emotion, but differently.
You could say they engage in emotional pacing for neural conditioning. In Russia, it's this constant cycle of fear and pride, creating an unshakable sense of national victimhood and heroic defiance. In the U.S., anxiety and reassurance move in waves, often timed with electoral cycles and defense budgets, fostering a constant need for protection. In China, a sense of calm and inevitability lulls the public into a kind of docile nationalism, suggesting the state always knows best.
So it's not just about controlling information.
It's about controlling interpretation. Media doesn't necessarily need to lie outright. It just needs to frame reality in a certain way. A missile strike becomes defense. A protest becomes instability. A dead child becomes regrettable collateral. And every single frame reinforces the system, normalizing the abnormal.
This brings us back to Orwell's doublespeak, making lies sound truthful.
He famously invented the term to describe using language not to communicate truth, but to obscure it, to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. And today, our sources show us the language of war has been scrubbed, polished, market-tested to an astonishing degree.
Like the examples you gave.
Exactly. Modern governments don't drop bombs. They conduct precision strikes. They don't spy on citizens. They engage in intelligence collection. They don't export tools of death. They provide security assistance. Orwell's terrifying fiction has truly become standard diplomatic fiction. It's semantic camouflage deployed globally.
And it's particularly noticeable in the language around arms trade and interventions.
Absolutely. Terms like defense cooperation, stabilization missions, force projection, they're routinely used to mask often violent realities. These euphemisms aren't accidental, they are intentional tools of propaganda. They allow imperial powers to operate in plain sight, shrouded in this bureaucratic fog. According to that RAND report, export or expire, these sanitized phrases are essential for making arms exports politically viable and economically justified.
Let's take peacekeeping. Sounds good.
Sounds great. In the public imagination, peacekeepers are neutral actors. But in reality, peacekeeping forces are often armed, embedded in resource-rich regions, shaped by the agendas of major military suppliers. China, for instance, has increased its participation in UN peacekeeping not just to boost its image, but also to test military logistics and export surveillance systems on the side. So peacekeeping can become a kind of Trojan horse for presence, control, arms diplomacy.
And precision strike. Sounds advanced. Careful.
It's lauded as this humanitarian evolution, suggesting minimal collateral damage. But researchers have shown these surgical strikes often rely on flawed intelligence, lead to significant civilian casualties, and deepen resentment. The term itself sanitizes the violence, stripping it of blood, consequence, accountability.
What about security cooperation? That sounds collaborative.
It's one of the most effective disguises for arms dealing. The phrase appears in nearly every U.S. Department of Defense document about military aid and training. But what it truly denotes is a pipeline of weapons, advisors, dollars. SIPRI's 2024 report highlights that U.S. security cooperation packages often include massive arms transfers to nations like Poland, Taiwan, Egypt, many contingent on continued military engagement. These programs are rarely just about peace. They are profoundly about influence, dependency, and ultimately profit.
And China and Russia have their own versions.
Similar linguistic tactics, yes. Beijing calls its arms packages defense modernization support, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia. Moscow brands its weapons deliveries as strategic partnerships or anti-terrorist collaborations, even when these shipments often end up with authoritarian regimes or irregular forces. Orwell's Ministry of Truth is alive and well. It just has a modern public relations team, ensuring language isn't a reflection of reality, but armor for these empires.
And this doublespeak seeps into domestic policy, too.
Absolutely. Surveillance programs in all three empires are branded as public safety initiatives. In the U.S., expanding facial recognition, AI border control, it's justified as community protection. In China, the same systems are called social harmony technologies. In Russia, anti-extremism laws criminalize dissent, targeting journalists, LGBTQ activists.
Even war crimes get renamed.
Right. Civilian casualties become collateral damage. Torture is rebranded as enhanced interrogation. Detainment without trial is preventive custody. Orwell described this linguistic erosion perfectly. He called it creating a reduced state of consciousness, a sleepwalking public lulled by words that mean nothing and hide everything.
So it's not just about what they do, but how they talk about it. The language itself becomes a weapon.
Which raises that important question. When language becomes hollow and truth is lost, how can citizens possibly demand accountability? It's semantic camouflage as a core strategy.
Building on that point about language and perception, let's talk about manufacturing consent 2.0. That phrase, originally from Herman and Chomsky, described how elites manipulate mass media to engineer public approval. Is that still relevant?
Extremely relevant. In our current age of military Keynesianism and proxy warfare, manufacturing consent isn't some Cold War relic. It's an operational necessity. And the tools have evolved. From crude telescreens, maybe, to sophisticated, global, algorithmically optimized systems.
You mentioned the American mirage. What does that mean in this context?
Well, U.S. media is often held up as the gold standard of press freedom. But as Chomsky and Herman argued way back, what's presented as news is filtered through ownership, advertising, sourcing. Today, that filter often includes a broader pro-military bias.
How so?
Defense contractors Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman routinely sponsor major news networks, especially cable and business TV. This creates these military economic echo chambers. Journalists might self-censor or subtly skew coverage to align with defense industry interests.
Is there evidence for that?
A study by the Quincy Institute found that over 80% of the defense experts interviewed on major U.S. networks between 2018 and 2021 had direct or indirect ties to the arms industry. Yet this is almost never disclosed to the audience.
80% undisclosed.
Right, so this isn't necessarily overt censorship, it's structural bias.
Yeah.
When military contractors fund your newsroom and former Pentagon officials dominate your expert panels, war starts to feel like the weather. Routine, unavoidable, just part of life.
Okay, so if American consent is manufactured partly through sponsorship, Russia does it differently, through a cult of siege.
Exactly. Russia engineers it through this cult of siege and cultural paranoia. Russian state media, RT, Channel 1, constantly push a narrative. Mother Russia is under attack. From NATO, liberalism, internal traders, every Ukrainian advance is framed as a NATO plot. Every protest is a CIA scheme. This framing sustains support for prolonged conflict and repression.
Making the war seem existential.
Precisely. A RAND analysis of Russian propaganda outlines how the Kremlin frames the war as existential. They flood domestic media with stories of historical grievance, cultural superiority, anti-Western resistance. It's like Orwell's 2 minutes hate, stretched across entire news cycles with an ever-morphing enemy always at the gates.
And this extends abroad, too, with disinformation campaigns.
Right? Targeting Ukrainian, Polish, Western audiences, blending conspiracy theories with doctored imagery. As shown in Captured Emotions, emotion-driven messaging, especially fear and nostalgia, consistently outperforms fact-based rebuttals in reach and effectiveness. The line between journalism and psychological warfare just disappears.
And China, they harmonize consent.
That's the term used. China doesn't manufacture consent through rage or free market saturation, it harmonizes it. The concept of social harmony permeates Chinese media policy. Unlike Russia's blunt instrument, China's state media employs soft censorship.
How does that work?
Removing sensitive topics, amplifying success stories, subtly steering attention away from controversy. Globally, Beijing exports this sanitized version of reality through CGTN, Confucius Institutes, platforms like TikTok. It's not overtly militaristic, but this narrative subtly undermines Western liberalism and reframes China as the stable, benevolent superpower.
So they position themselves as the alternative.
Right. China seeks to discredit Western military intervention not by opposing it directly, but by offering itself as the non-interventionist, non-hypocritical alternative. That's their brand. Peace through control. Even as it becomes one of the largest exporters of riot gear, facial recognition systems, AI surveillance tools to regimes with questionable human rights records.
And technology like AI makes this easier. Deepfakes.
Disinformation is no longer limited to crude memes. Advances in AI enable the production of deepfake synthetic media indistinguishable from reality, and these tools are in active deployment by multiple state actors. Russian-linked accounts have used voice-cloned leaders to spread fake announcements. China has used AI avatars to present fake news in human-like form.
What about the U.S.?
The U.S. has invested heavily in counter-disinformation technology, but sources also indicate it has funded covert influence operations of its own. SIPRI's analysis, combined with RAND's insights, shows these systems aren't just defensive, they're offensive. Disinformation is a first-strike capability in the 21st century. It can destabilize elections, discredit peace movements, muddy public consensus on war. Every viral post is like a bullet. Every manipulated headline, a drone strike on truth.
And the ultimate twist. Our phones.
Our smartphones have become the telescreens of today. Citizens willingly carry these surveillance-capable devices. They track our location, listen to conversations, shape our worldview through algorithms. TikTok's data collection capabilities are vast. Facebook's AI predicts not just preferences, but behaviors. WeChat in China integrates commerce, communication, identification, making dissent incredibly difficult.
So the state doesn't even need to watch us directly.
Not always. The algorithm already knows what you'll likely do, what you think, what will engage you. In this world, war isn't just televised. It's curated, hashtagged, monetized. Manufacturing consent 2.0 is this pervasive, ever-present reality.
Okay, let's try to bring some of this together. In Orwell's 1984, that perpetual state of warfare wasn't really about winning. It was a mechanism of control, consumption, continuity. War, Orwell wrote, is now a purely internal affair.
A chilling line.
And today, this unsettling prophecy finds eerie resonance across the political economies of the United States, China, and Russia. Our world seems managed by these three competing empires. Their ideological hostilities are real, no doubt, yet their economic incentives often seem to align in weird ways. The question isn't just whether war is profitable anymore, but really, for whom?
And the answer, as the sources clearly show, is that the defense industry is a massive economic engine, particularly in the U.S. The post-9/11 era ushered in a golden age for military contractors. Defense spending, as we said, exceeded $800 billion in 2023, more than the next 10 countries combined, according to SIPRI.
But where does that money actually go?
Well, the profits didn't primarily flow to frontline soldiers or veteran support programs. They flowed disproportionately to the Pentagon's chosen firms. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. Those four firms alone earned a combined $196 billion in revenue in 2022, and they saw significant surges following new arms packages to Ukraine and Taiwan.
And the Ukraine aid itself acted as a stimulus.
Economically, yes, while politically framed as humanitarian. Of that $174 billion allocated by Congress, a vast portion went directly into weapons stockpiles and contracts to restock them. President Zelensky himself pointed this out, saying a large share of U.S. aid actually goes to the U.S. defense industry.
While U.S. arms exports surged globally.
Right, to 43% of the world total between 2020 and 2024, more than 4 times France. The replenishment of NATO stockpiles, the expanded militarization of Eastern Europe, it created this feedback loop. The political legitimacy of aid masked its underlying capitalist mechanics. Weapons have to move to keep production viable. Demand must be sustained for innovation to continue. And public support has to be managed to maintain the illusion of benevolent force.
Politicians benefit too, beyond campaign donations.
Yes, by leveraging fear, nationalism, and job creation to win votes. Military Keynesianism allows lawmakers to frame war industries as engines of growth. As William Hartung of the Quincy Institute writes, every conflict, every crisis becomes an opportunity for influence and procurement expansion. Representatives proudly announce new weapons factories or maintenance contracts as victories for their districts, often regardless of the global consequences.
How does China fit this pattern? They seem less interventionist directly.
China follows a parallel pattern, just structured differently. While it maintains that aura of non-interventionism, it benefits immensely from arms sales paired with infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. As one study explains, BRI client states frequently purchase Chinese arms as part of broader diplomatic agreements.
So it's economic leverage.
Right. China may frame these actions as peaceful, but the economic logic of selling surveillance equipment, riot gear, drones, it mirrors U.S. practices in outcome, if not always in method. Even without direct military engagement, the production and sale of coercive tools enables a kind of soft imperialism under the guise of economic partnership.
And Russia. Their situation seems different, bleaker.
It is bleaker economically. Once a leading exporter, its arms sales plummeted 64%, as we noted. Key clients like India and China pivoted away due to sanctions and performance issues exposed in Ukraine. Still, the Russian state remains fundamentally tethered to conflict.
How so if sales are down?
As its domestic economy falters, it exploits its remaining leverage, fossil fuels, propaganda, to maintain relevance. State-controlled media justifies conflict with moral fervor, even as its military machinery rusts. Desperation seems to breed escalation. Every Ukrainian counteroffensive is met with renewed Kremlin rhetoric about existential threats, Nazi encirclement. Narratives that arguably stabilize Putin's rule internally, even as they destabilize the entire region.
The sources mentioned Orwellian insurance policies. What's that about?
It connects back to Orwell's idea of the war economy, not just being about bullets, but about the internal logic of permanent mobilization. Today, defense portfolios are traded on Wall Street. Investors track conflicts like sports scores. War, once seen as a failure of diplomacy, is now almost a predictive asset class.
Like insurance.
As one Polish official cynically put it, according to the sources, weapons are a form of perpetual insurance. Insurance against what? Collapse, maybe? Irrelevance? Unemployment? A missile factory is politically harder to defund than a public school. A surveillance program can always find a new enemy to justify its existence. This political theology of militarism seems to have replaced the language of peace.
So Orwell's dystopia enforced loyalty through fear.
And today's empires often use comfort, distraction, economic interdependence as well. The citizen doesn't necessarily march blindly to war. They scroll, they cheer, maybe they buy the stocks. The state doesn't always need to draft them. It incentivizes them, subtly or overtly.
So who really wins from war? Who are the beneficiaries?
Defense executives, absolutely. Politicians riding the coattails of nationalism. Technocrats designing predictive AI for drones. Analysts writing justifications for preemptive strikes. But the sources argue the greatest beneficiary is the system itself.
The system?
This triumvirate of empire, capital, and information that binds the U.S., China, and Russia. Not just in competition, but in a kind of shared addiction to power through perpetual militarization. While profits soar for some, the human cost is immeasurable. The suffering of civilians in Mariupol, Sana, Rafah, potentially Taipei, they become cannon fodder or collateral damage. It stands in stark contrast to the billions earned by this pervasive global war economy.
If you want a picture of the future, Orwell once warned, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. That vision. It's not just metaphorical, is it? In our current geopolitical structure, war seems to become not only a political tool, but almost an economic necessity.
It feels that way sometimes. The empires of the United States, China, Russia seem caught in this paradox. To truly disarm might destabilize the very markets, alliances, and national identities upon which they are built.
So if we accept that perpetual militarization is inevitable, we resign ourselves to Orwell's bleak prophecy.
Which poses an urgent moral question. Can peace even be imagined, let alone built within a system seemingly designed to profit from its absence?
What do the sources say about the barriers? Why is disarmament so hard?
Well, the sources are clear. The systemic barriers are immense. Historically, efforts at global arms control and disarmament have mostly floundered. Treaties like the INF Treaty, the CFE Treaty, they've either been abandoned or eroded by accusations of noncompliance, shifting global strategies.
And major powers aren't fully on board.
China was never a participant in many of those Cold War agreements. Russia has suspended participation in the New START Treaty. Even the UN's Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, passed in 2017, hasn't been ratified by any nuclear-armed state. They just ignore it.
Meanwhile, spending keeps going up.
Consistently, SIPRI's reports show an alarming rise in military expenditure across all three major powers, even during economic downturns. Global arms spending hit nearly $2.44 trillion in 2023, the highest level ever recorded.
So it's not an accident. It's driven by...
Not solely by military necessity, the sources argue, but by a profit structure embedded in the very design of international power. The disarmament agenda isn't just a logistical challenge, it's a profound threat to entrenched interests. Imagine a world without war. It would render hundreds of billions of dollars in arms trade and surveillance contracts obsolete overnight. Political capital built on military strength would evaporate. The world would need a new organizing myth, one not based on enemies and escalation, but maybe on dignity and cooperation. And no empire seems eager to trade its sword for a scalpel, so to speak.
And now there's this added complication, climate militarism.
Yeah, that's a shocking twist. Even as the planet faces ecological collapse, military budgets keep ballooning. Studies show the Pentagon is one of the world's largest institutional carbon emitters. Yet instead of reallocating resources towards mitigation or adaptation, nations seem to be preparing for a militarized climate future. Fortifying borders against climate refugees, designing autonomous drones for disaster zones, even envisioning future wars over water and arable land. A warming world, rather than humbling our war machines, is being framed as the next theater of conflict, providing new justifications for military expansion.
Okay, so given all these barriers, what would peace truly require? It's clearly not just a ceasefire or a summit meeting.
No, it demands something much deeper, a total restructuring of human incentives, media narratives, political priorities. Our sources do suggest some potential pathways forward, though they're challenging.
Such as?
First, massive divestment from defense contractors and surveillance corporations. Imagine reallocating even just 10% of the U.S.'s $800+ billion annual defense budget. That could fund universal pre-K nationwide or a complete overhaul of the national electric grid for green energy. Huge transformative potential.
Okay, divestment. What else?
Second, radical transparency and oversight. Implement independent auditing of arms exports and military aid. Limit things like the Presidential Drawdown Authority. Require genuine congressional approval for all international arms transfers. RAND has shown how opaque procedures allow defense contractors to profit largely unchecked.
Good.
Global disarmament incentives. Maybe tying international aid and trade agreements to verifiable demilitarization benchmarks. Using the leverage of institutions like the IMF and World Bank not to enforce austerity, but to reward peaceful investment and conflict resolution. Flip the script.
What about new technologies like AI?
Fourth, AI disarmament protocols. Establish international frameworks for banning or regulating autonomous weapon systems, killer robots. The same machine learning used to guide missiles could theoretically be used to model complex diplomatic solutions if we reprogrammed our priorities.
And finally, dealing with the past.
Fifth, truth commissions and memory culture. Acknowledge historical arms abuses Vietnam, Iraq, Xinjiang, Chechnya, and truly memorialize the civilian lives lost. Just as post-apartheid South Africa used truth and reconciliation to try and build trust, maybe a global reckoning with military harm could humanize the true cost of war, make it less abstract.
These are huge reforms. They won't come easily.
Definitely not. They require immense political courage, corporate accountability, and frankly, a true public awakening. But the alternative, this endless cycle of proxy wars, disinformation, technological escalation, where does that lead? It feels like it leads only towards collective extinction, or at least perpetual misery for many. It asks us to resist seeing Orwell's fatalism as foresight, but maybe see it as a potential surrender we can choose not to make.
The object of power is power.
But breaking that loop requires imagining something truly radical, that the future belongs not to the empire but to the human.
So, after diving deep into these intricate, often unsettling realities of the global war economy, what stands out most to you? If the object of power really is just power, how do we possibly break that loop?
Perhaps the only empire worth building now is the one we've never dared to truly imagine. One where the boot Orwell described is finally lifted and the human face beneath it can finally heal. That means consciously choosing to imagine a world where nations compete not in arms races, but maybe in cures for disease, in carbon capture technology, in acts of global generosity. It means demanding news cycles driven by peacemaking breakthroughs, not just missile footage. It means reclaiming our words, our future, from the pervasive doublespeak that masks the true cost of conflict. It requires us, I think, to move beyond fatalism and actively try to build a world where compassion and shared security are the foundation, not just some fleeting idealistic hope.